Um, so I believe the official scientific definition of dehumanization is that a phenomenon whereby the full humanness of one or more human beings is denied, resulting in violent suffering or other unfortunate outcomes. So what I'd like to do in the session is to expand our collective awareness of the many forms that dehumanization can take, to think hard about whether we participate unwittingly in certain forms of dehumanization. And also I'm interested in the biological and cultural causes of dehumanization and the kind of things we can do to prevent it. So any of those questions is fair game. I'll mention a couple things to perhaps pique your interest a bit. Dehumanization has been implicated in many of the worst crimes against humanity, from genocide to slavery, to the denial of suffrage, systemic and non-systemic racism. Various caste systems seem to rely on dehumanization. Various draconian or inhumane immigration policies seem to be driven by, or if not, or supported by, dehumanizing portrayals of immigrants. And there's, to my eyes, an emerging consensus among psychologists and biologists that human beings are rightly characterized as having sort of a default decency setting towards our fellow human beings. And so that special efforts must be made to induce human beings to be truly evil or especially destructive towards one another. And so dehumanization, I think, is often a phenomenon whereby some people get others to view third parties as lesser, thereby paving the way towards the maltreatment. Okay, so why don't we start with a question that helps to just sort of expand our sense of the phenomenon we're looking at. We'll do some more in the way of diagnosis and prescription later, but just so that we can get our heads around the full extent of the phenomenon, I want to invite you to mention one or more forms that it takes, anything from an example to a type. I'll mention one or two just to get the ball rolling, but then I really want to shut up and hear from you guys. I remember a high school history class that talked about the way in which the US government propaganda dehumanized the Japanese in order to motivate our efforts in World War II. So rather than, you can easily probably remember films where US armed service people derisively refer to the Japanese as Japs, for example. Sometimes shorthand derogatory terms like that take the place of more full-blooded characterizations, thereby sort of giving people permission to wage war against people of that type. So that's just an example from history, but any good historian will be able to cite many examples whereby one group dehumanizes another to pave the way for some end. Okay, please help me expand our collective awareness of the many forms this takes. Francesco?
Yeah, I want to give you a personal experience briefly. You know, I am from Cuba originally. I came to this country when I was 13 years old as a refugee. And my parents, I came to live with a family, and I'm not going to go into great detail. My family left a few months afterwards. And, you know, we were middle class here. We became sort in the poor area. And you know, we live in a neighborhood in Miami where all Cubans usually go through, and right next to an area that is called Liberty City, which was the African American neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have a car. We went to church on Sunday, and we took a bus.
Yeah.
And the bus went straight through Liberty City, and I would say that it was probably 98% African American riding on that bus.
Okay.
And it's a Sunday. So, you know, most people were dressing their best because they were going to church. And I remember one experience, the very first time that we did this. My father was in the bus, my mother, and my two sisters. I realized that, you know, obviously in this bus, everybody was sitting everywhere because that was the majority, but we found some place to sit.
Okay.
My father, you know, my father always taught me that if someone comes into the bus that is older than you or is in need of a seat, you give it to them. And there was an occasion for that in this bus.
Okay.
My father and I got up. I was 13, so I could handle that. And we gave the seat to some African American people. And they were, you know, they were, I was flabbergasted by their reaction. They didn't want to take it.
Interesting.
You know?
Fascinating. But in a way, you were humanizing them, right?
Yes, yes. But so that's, you know, I think that's the point that I was going to make, that dehumanization becomes so deeply ingrained that most likely continues to be maintained.
And even a simple act of decency can shock somebody who's used to being diminished by others.
Yes.
Very nice, Francesco. Thank you very much for sharing that example.
Thank you.
I like that. Anyone else? Jeremy.
Yeah.
Oh, I think we need to unmute you, Jeremy. Can you do that?
Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes. Francesco's anecdote fits in with what I was going to say, because at my school, and I was at school in the 1940s and 50s, the toilets were known as the Japs. And this was just after the Second World War. And that leads me immediately to Martha Nussbaum, who's written about dehumanization of women. And what she says is that women are kind of dehumanized because they're seen as kind of creatures of biology. You know, they have sort of bodily secretions that make them less than human. So I want to make 2 points. Point number one is dehumanization actually involves a kind of projection of parts of oneself that one is kind of are unacceptable. So in a way, one's shit was projected, everyone shits, but one's shit was projected onto the Japs. And similarly, in a way, the kind of biologyness, the sweatiness, the smelliness, the secretionness of humanity, in the case of dehumanization of women, according to Martha Nussbaum, and I found her argument convincing, is projected. So there's a kind of way in which dehumanization, in a way, takes a bit of your humanity, but a bit that's unacceptable to you, and puts it into the other. Actually, I have got another point, but I'll hang on to that for the moment.
Thank you for that, Jeremy. Nice. Steve? And Eric, I see you. Coming to you next.
I just had 2 comments. One is, I think there's findings working with soldiers that dehumanizing the enemy is emotionally necessary for them to be able to go kill people. Yeah. And when they don't dehumanize the enemy, they have a great deal of difficulty doing, quote unquote, their job. The other comment I was going to make is that I'm not sure I agree with you that the default position is to be decent to other people. Maybe I would modify that to say the default position is to be decent to people that you see as in your group. But I would think the default position instinctually for people that are perceived as others is to be anything but decent. And that group identity is easily formed and not very rational. The clearest example of that would be, we could think about sports fans who have absolutely nothing at stake other than vicarious emotional satisfaction. And yet they can be, the group identities can be very intense, easily maintained, and can even lead to violence.
Very nice. Thank you, Steve. Eric, chime in.
Yeah, one example I can think of, it goes back to the 19th century with the immigrants to this country. You know, you think the signs in New York and elsewhere, no Irish need apply. You know, the Irish were, you know, inherently criminal and not worthy of being associated with the other people who are already here. And then once they gained respectability, that was transferred to the Italians in the next wave, and so on and so forth. And now it shows up with, you know, our current president's obsession with the Mexicans, who are, you know, rapists and drug, you know, smugglers and all that.
Yeah, and I believe
after another coming into the country is always dehumanized.
Yeah, and you know, Eric, if I'm remembering right, there have been times when our American president has characterized Hispanics as animals.
Yes,
He's certainly characterized Democrats as animals, and that's supposed to be one of the sort of canonical or paradigm ways of dehumanizing somebody, is to basically reduce them to an animal and thereby sort of not worthy of the same moral consideration they might otherwise get. Thank you, Eric. Patricia.
I'd like to bring up the dehumanization that we see in the healthcare profession, where clients or patients are often defined by their illness or their conditions, some of which have, you know, connotations of they brought this on themselves. So somebody who has cancer as a result of smoking. So, you know, they're referred to as, you know, the lung in 312, and, you know, a heavy smoker for years and years. And having worked in the healthcare profession, I can, you know, speak to that. Does happen. I think with increased awareness of dehumanizing examples, I think there has been certainly a push to be more humane and more person and client centered, but it still does exist.
And that's a fascinating example, in part because it's emerged sort of right in the heart of the scientific community. You can imagine a certain form of clinical detachment being very healthy for patients, like, right? To some degree, a doctor or a nurse and a scientist need to be objective. And yet, when that becomes a case of a matter of referring to a patient as just a case, or and, you know, just forgetting or neglecting entirely to interact with them as a person.
It is a very fine line, because, you know, when you speak to patients about their experience, it is the empathy and the warmth that they remember often more than the information that you're imparting, or the way that you impart that information as a cold clinical, you know, differential diagnosis versus, you know, a human to the conversation.
And it wouldn't surprise me if that warmth actually pays benefits in terms of, you know, recovery rates and healing.
Absolutely,
Well,
absolutely.
Thank you, Patricia. Daniela?
I just, from a different perspective, from an anthropological perspective, in a lot of more traditional societies, kids aren't seen as human until they reach a certain stage of development as fully human. So sometimes that might be cutting their teeth, or when they can start contributing to the household. With the Kung Bushman, when they're born, they're not seen as fully human. They're only seen as fully human once a mother has picked them up and brought them back to the village. And what that opens the door to is it opens the door to infanticide, when kids are either born with some kind of congenital problem or when mum's already nursing. So you know, there's considerable infanticide. I mean, it's in most traditional human societies under a limited number of conditions. And one of the things that opens the door to it is seeing the newborn as not yet fully human.
Fascinating. And of course, there's quite a good bit of political controversy about whether treating a fetus as a clump of cells is itself a form of dehumanization. Good. Paula? By the way, just quickly, if you can put down your hand after you've finished with your chance to speak, then I can it's easier to keep track of who. And David, it looks to me like maybe you're looking to speak too. I'll try to get you in here soon. But Paula, did you?
Yes.
Yes, please.
I was just going to follow on from Patricia. Can you hear me, by the way? Is this okay? Yeah, thanks. I suppose the active attempts to dehumanize by languaging people in a particular way is the obvious way of looking at it. But what struck me about what Patricia said is about how the structures within which people work dehumanize, cause them to dehumanize others. And I'm thinking of, for example, my own mum, and she had breast cancer as a young woman. I remember her outrage when the surgeon came into the room the following day after her mastectomy, and with all of his trainee doctors in tow, and said, "So now we'll go to the left breast in bed number whatever," which had just been removed. So she was had enough of her wits about her to be outraged and say, my name is Nora and I don't have a left breast anymore. And that someone of that kind of in that profession and it would say that it's outrageous. But someone recently, we were talking about this, was saying to me about a woman who's a doctor right now working in the hospital, who was attending to a woman who was elderly and near death. Mm-hmm. But she had been working for 3 days straight. And by the end of that, whatever, I can't, 50-hour shift or whatever, 36-hour shift, she said, I was so tired. I just sat beside that woman and I just thought to myself, please die. Now, and I think that it's easy for us to talk about the Germans or the Japs or the Americans or war, but I think that the structures within which we work, and especially with technology, makes it really, really easy these days to dehumanize.
So dehumanization can become sort of embedded in our norms and practices and institutions. I'm certainly, the Black Lives Matter movement here in the US and its attempt to bring systemic racism is definitely trying to push, trying to increase awareness of that, right? Ways in which the system can discriminate and thereby dehumanize people. Yeah, that's it.
I think it's the systems, and I know other people have to get in there, but I think that actually we're designing systems specifically to get humanity out. In fact, even I just tried to make several telephone calls to my local supermarket. They don't want to answer the phone. They would really rather you just align yourself with their system. So it's so endemic now that I think the task of rehumanizing is just huge.
Yeah, I have to turn that into a question. With a show of your real hands here, tell me how many of you have ended up on a automated phone answering system asking you to press various buttons and felt dehumanized by that? So maybe perhaps that's at the less destructive end of the spectrum of dehumanizations, but it's certainly part of the phenomenon. Good. Jeremy.
Well, 2 points. And one seems to be the key, in my view, to dehumanization is theory of mind. The key issue that when you dehumanize someone is you no longer think of them as having a mind, and therefore they no longer are, as it were, like you. But I'm also,
Jeremy, just a quick question, if you'd be willing to expand that just a bit. What if you just diminish the, if you attribute a less than fully human mind, not no mind at all, but a diminished mind in some way?
Well, I mean, you've already mentioned abortion, and the sort of liberal justification for abortion is that a mind hasn't developed, and therefore it is not dehumanizing and it's not murder, which is debatable, but that is the argument, as it seems to me. And the same, of course, applies to farming and eating animals. They haven't got minds. So it seems to me that's the crucial thing. When we dehumanize, we remove the mind. And I suppose we have to sort of say that there's an adaptive aspect to dehumanizing, which came out from the comment about surgery. You know, I'm a medic. You know, if you go into an operating theatre, what does the surgeon do? He covers the entire patient with cloth other than the area that needs to be dealt with. He or she doesn't want to have to think about that person as having a mind, because you're sticking a knife into someone who's got a mind. So I'm just saying, I think that's the crucial thing. And then the other final point is to do with rage, because that's come up so quickly in several comments. There's something about being dehumanized, which evokes rage. And one can see this again in sort of positive and negative terms. So the positive aspect, obviously, say Black Lives Matter. The negative terms might be in the sort of anti-abortion movement. And I think, again, I've got Jewish heritage, so that one of the big issues is what happened to the rage in Nazi Germany in the 1930s.
Wow, terrific question. Eric, would you like to build on that?
Yeah, I'd like to, if you could entertain a case that's kind of the opposite of this, but that also proves the hypothesis we're discussing. And if we could extend our community to the natural world. I was reading something recently where somebody was talking about, you know, if we think of the trees and the salmon and the deer as people, you know, talk to them as he's and she's and it's, we tend to respect them more than we would otherwise, and take care of them better than we would otherwise. So it's kind of rehumanizing in a way, but it also goes to, you know, support what we're all talking about here.
Yeah, actually, Eric, in an article I read to prepare for this, I came across the point that dehumanization is regarded by some scientists sort of the inverse of anthropomorphizing. So if you take a tree and attribute emotions or feelings to it, that's kind of the opposite of stripping away feelings or mind from a human being that is presumed initially to have them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But even if we don't go that far as to attribute emotions to them, if we just consider them as you know, he's and she's or whatever pronoun we prefer, that still leads us to more respect for that creature.
And the Gaia hypothesis, right, which attributes consciousness or something like it to the ecosystem as a whole, is obviously has some, to the extent that that might cause us to treat the environment with more respect, that might very well be a good thing. Francesco?
Yeah, I see, of course, from my angle, the way that I look at things, I see dehumanization as a learned behavior. Okay, and as a learned behavior, it can be changed, and that's the positive side of that. However, I also am curious as to the effect of dehumanization to the person who is being dehumanized.
The person who's doing the
to the person who's being dehumanized, the recipient of it. I don't know if you remember the book that was published by Mary and Herrnstein, The Bell Curve. Widely controversial, published in the mid-90s, if I remember. Very controversial, misunderstood, and misused. Because they did a scientific study of the African American, in how they did on intellectual testing and academic testing. And the population that they sampled didn't do very well. And they ended up by proposing some strategies to change that. Okay. However, the people who were, the African American community and a lot of the people who really were involved in the cause misinterpreted it as being a negative thing. You know, that they were sort of putting them down by saying they're inferior.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
And basically the message, you know, was, you know, they were not really inferior. What is inferior is what we did to them.
Gotcha. Yes, thank you. Patricia, can you run with that? We need your voice back, Patricia.
There. As I was reading about all the different examples of dehumanization in the attached reading, the first question that came to my mind is the definition of humanness. And I started reading the article, the more in-depth article, but didn't have time to complete it. So it really, just in all of this, really makes me want to explore that a lot more in terms of how we define what is humanness.
I'm really glad you raised that, Patricia, because the author of that article, a guy named Haslam, I think, he's done a lot of work. He's one of the big names in this field of scientists who study dehumanization, and he is led to reflect on, you know, what exactly do we mean by human when we talk about dehumanization? And he goes through the literature, lots of different examples of things that scientists call dehumanization, and he ends up with a typology arguing that you can deny human beings what is considered a uniquely human characteristic. So take some characteristic that you might think we have, but the rest of the animal king doesn't. I don't know, consciousness or higher order consciousness, or however you want to define it. I'm not going to defend this view. I'm just using it as an example. And then if you deny that to a human being, that's kind of the essence of dehumanization. It's one of two essential types of dehumanization that Haslam mentions. The other involves arguing that certain qualities are fundamentally human or somehow core or essential to being human, and then denying. So for example, I don't know, I guess being two-legged is not essential to being human, but having the capacity for empathy, you might say, is essential to being human. If you then deny a capacity for empathy to one or more human beings, that might be a route towards dehumanizing them. I'm not sure how I find Haslam's typology particularly useful or interesting, but the question he raises there, you know, what exactly do we consider essential or core or unique about human beings such that we must strip that away from people in order to mistreat them? Steve.
Yeah, I put my hand up when Francisco said that he thought dehumanizing others was primarily learned. And I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of nature versus nurture too far, but I would have probably have said the opposite, that I think it's primarily instinctual. At the very least, I think we come out of the womb primed to form in-group and out-group identities. And it doesn't take much for culture to stoke that up. And Andrew, in the beginning, you raised what can we do to fight dehumanization. And I think what the research shows is that, and it goes back to the issue of group identity and in-group and out-group, is that if you interact with people from quote unquote the out-group, it's very difficult to continue to dehumanize them. Yes. I've read things in the news about Arabs and Israelis who have connected in the Middle East, and it's hard to dehumanize. I have two Trump supporting Republican friends, and I stay friends with them to make it harder for them to dehumanize Democrats. So at any rate, I'll stop there.
I think these are really nice points. I mean, on the one hand, I want to also validate what I heard Francesco saying. Was it Francesco who said? Sorry.
Said what? What?
Oh, that
it's a learned behavior.
Is learned. That it's a learned behavior. Yeah. I mean, many people say that hate is learned, and I think there's pretty good evidence for that. That nobody is born hating anybody automatically. But I think Steve's point is also very much to the point. We do seem to have evolved a certain xenophobic tendencies that are easily triggered under certain conditions. And so becoming aware of the cultural or environmental conditions that trigger our xenophobic tendencies to dehumanize has got to be an important part of combating the phenomenon. And just the fact that we're so easily tipped from treating somebody as fully human to maybe not treating them, no longer treating them as fully human. I mean, a steady diet of words like Jap and spick and wop and the N-word and so on like that will have a tendency to, in fact, it takes far less than deliberately hateful language to get us to begin to diminish one another. There were some studies that basically randomly assign kids to a red team and a blue team, and then basically use a survey to try to understand the attitudes they take towards kids in the other group. And even very young kids with just a little bit of prompting from a teacher will start speaking of the blue group members as somehow less feeling or less capable of feeling pain, or so we're astonishingly easy to push to the point where we begin dehumanizing, at least in subtle ways. Yeah, Alan.
I've been reading this book, Survival of the Friendliest. Although it begins with dogs, about the last half of it is about this subject of dehumanization and how it comes about, but principally about how it is provoked into being used as a tool. The idea is that we get devoted to protecting our tribe or our group. We get so devoted to it that we can kill for it, not just die for it. And this can happen quite easily. And the other serious matter is that the biggest provocation for dehumanizing is to feel that they are trying to dehumanize you, so it feeds upon itself. It's a very serious matter. I'm principally interested in education of children and how we do that. I just make 2 points. I live in a city, Leicester, that is very mixed in religion, and we have far fewer problems about it. So that comes back to the idea that if you know people as a co-gardener, shall we say, in an allotment or whatever, you tend not to be able to dehumanize them. And the other interesting point I think that was made was about abortion and related things with hunter-gatherer groups. I remember many years ago reading about one such group, and this woman says, well, I went off with my daughter, quite a young daughter, to give birth to the place that we used for this. Just went off to give birth. And I gave birth. And I looked at it and I said, oh, we don't want another one. I'm just going to bury it. And it was the daughter who said, oh, no, mother, you can't do it. She said, rather, you can make something of that in terms of how natural humanization is. Is it innate? So it's got to be it's got to be beaten back by realizing that you don't have the wherewithal, or it's going to be a lot of trouble. Anyhow, I'll keep that.
Fascinating. That's a really interesting anecdote, Alan. Thank you. If I'm getting the science right on this, the neurohormone oxytocin was identified in the early 21st century as triggering powerful bonding emotions, like a mother will experience a flood of oxytocin when she's nursing her child, making her that much more bonded to the child. And so there were even some books written with titles like The Love Molecule or that kind of thing. And then it was discovered in about 2010 that when people's xenophobic fears are triggered, their brains get flooded by oxytocin too. And so it's not, so the oxytocin doesn't just bond within group, it also drives wedges between groups. It's far from a molecule that is morally unproblematic. There are times when oxytocin floods people's brains and brings out the worst in us.
Yeah. The worst time to go amongst cows is when they have their young with them.
Francesco, are you?
Yeah, Andy, that's an interesting point, because again, you're making the point that a lot of that depends on your experience. And one of the things that has been demonstrated is the really tremendous power of the environment. And one of the things that I really get upset to my colleagues in psychology is that they don't really recognize the power of the environment. The environment can change the genetic predisposition. The environment can change your brain wiring. Okay?
That's right.
So the bottom line is that, you know, look at the implications of that in regards to developing a science that is going to be a conciliant science, bringing all these things together, like E.O. Wilson proposes. You know.
Well, and it's dangerous to conclude, for example. I mean, so there's lots of research now that shows how tribal our thinking can become, but to assume that human beings are just in 100% innately tribal, oh well, there's nothing we can do about it, might as well just resign ourselves to a life riven by tribal conflict. That's clearly an inadequate, an improper series of inferences.
Pretty depressing.
And too depressing than is either good for us, or I would argue even true. To whatever extent our xenophobic instincts are inherited, it is also true that there are environmental conditions that can dampen or amplify those tendencies. That's right.
The gentleman,
Steve,
I just want to, one last point before I go. The gentleman that spoke before me, I don't remember his name, made a statement that I heard today, which is the power of education. And that's where we begin.
Beautiful. I love it. Steve?
I would just say that going back to the nature-nurture issue and tribal stuff, I don't think what changes is our instinct to be tribal. I think what experience changes is who we define as in our tribe, which is maybe a different way to parse this. Goes back to Peter Singer's work about the expanding circle and how we continually, and throughout human history, we begin to define our tribe as bigger and bigger and bigger. But I still think that the instinctual and even the neurological substrate of in-group and out-group is there. And what experience does is just get us to change our definitions of who's in our in-group.
That's good. And that also reminds me, actually this doesn't detract from what you're saying in the least, Steve. And it's also true that we identify with multiple groups at the same time. So in addition to being a Democrat and a philosopher. I'm a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, for example, and I was deriding Trump as an idiot not too long ago, and when preparing for this, I wondered if I was participating in dehumanization. Like there, I was stripping Donald Trump, the president of our nation, of a certain quality we associate with humanity, intelligence. I think about so much of the late night comedian TV shows that he ridicule and derision, and wonder to what extent my enjoyment of that makes me complicit in a subtle form of dehumanization that is driving two political factions in America apart. I mention this because I think all of us probably participate, even if we are huge fans of Singer's expanding circle and expanding the circle to all of humanity and even beyond. In all of those ways, we can still participate in activities that get us to diminish certain groups in ways that do make a difference.
Yeah.
So it's not as though you can read a particular argument by Peter Singer that says there's no non-arbitrary way to deny people of another race or even animals moral consideration. You can process that argument intellectually as fully as you like. Do your best to think and feel, to fully include other sentient life forms within your moral circle, and still find yourself doing things like deriding people from another party.
Yeah. There is
I'm sorry. Here, go ahead, Alan.
there is the fact that people are sociable. They do take pleasure in society, in conversation. They feel safe when they know that they are supported and so on. So there's another side to human nature as well as this. This is a tool, I think, although it has neurological foundations.
Nice. Eric?
Your comment about the president raises a question with me as to how much is dehumanization as a concept, is it applied to groups rather than as opposed to individuals? It seems we've mostly been talking about groups. Interesting thoughts on that, groups versus individuals.
Yeah, so I think that all of the following verbs apply, are closely associated with dehumanization, if nothing else. Denigrating, debasing, excluding, typecasting, stereotyping. Apparently some scholars are talking about dignity taking. So there are ways of talking about or treating people that take away their dignity, and that's a form of dehumanization. How about objectifying? I believe that there's some very good work suggesting that pornography that dehumanizes or objectifies women, that pornography that objectifies women is dehumanizing. I think would be another form of dehumanization that's worth thinking about and addressing. I'll mention a couple things that I come across recently. Apparently, power and high status have a certain effects on the brain that cause us, human beings generally, to think less of lower status people or low power or people with less influence. So if you give a ton of money and influence and power to some people, they'll start perceiving other people as lesser. I don't know that effect is universal. I don't know that, but apparently it's quite pronounced, and at least in group studies, they can find very significant correlations in that phenomenon. And just because we're coming close to the end of the hour, I wanted to echo something I heard, I think it was Steve say before. There's a lot of good research now that just suggests that contact with people from another group makes it much harder to dehumanize them. Now, it must be the case that the kind of contact matters, right? So if you contact somebody in a superficial way, that might make it slightly harder to dehumanize them. But if you contact somebody and have a deep, meaningful conversation where you understand their hopes and fears, my guess is it becomes much, much harder to dehumanize them. And so one concern is that the internet is encouraging forms of connection that are more superficial, less meaningful, and perhaps less capable of curing us of a tendency to dehumanize. It'd be nice if somehow somebody were to redesign portions of the internet in ways that provide for much deeper and more meaningful forms of connection. I think we're doing a pretty good job of that right here. It takes we're all having to practice focusing our attention in ways, in new ways, to make this happen. But I'm actually thrilled that you guys are part of this experiment in trying to connect deeply about for a better understanding of the human condition. So perhaps we're slightly less inclined to dehumanize each other now than we were an hour ago when we began.
Hope so.
Let's hope so. Let's see, I want to get I have time for a couple of very short words from David Curry. I don't think you've had a chance to speak yet.
Mute myself. There we go. I've unmuted myself. So a couple of thoughts that I have, and I'd appreciate any feedback that the group might have on this. But I'll riff off of what you were talking about, Andrew, the power and status. So what distinguishes that mindset, if you will, that we are separate, that we are we have dominion over others, we're the overlords, right? And it seems to me that throughout history, this hasn't been common in the human race for most of our history since we were, emerging humans on this planet. But after the age of reason, it became more and more common that we gathered this sense that God made us particularly special. And so therefore we have dominion over all that's on this planet. And so we separated ourselves from our true human nature, which actually comes to us from everything that's made on Earth, right? Stardust. And so we've become separate from that. And it's by learning to connect back again with our true nature that we'll become interconnected. And then once we're interconnected and interdependent, it seems to me it's foolish to dehumanize someone else because it hurts me, because everything is connected. And I think that's the trend that's going on right now. And that's the evolutionary transition that we're in. So how do we promote that?
Very nice, David. That's, I think, kind of a wonderful note to end on. I do see that a couple of people still have things they'd like to say. I'm going to hit the pause button here, though, and ask you all to join me in voting on a topic for next month. So those of you who've been here before will know the procedure. I'm about to describe 3 possible topics for next month's session. You can vote for as many of them as you like, and I'll ask you to vote for them using the blue hand in the participants window. Sage, would you do me the favor of tallying the totals? Thank you. Okay, a quick word on each. So one would be the biology of status. What's the science of, say, evolutionary psychology teaching us about status, and what lessons can we take from that science and other sciences to better understand how status affects our lives? So that's topic number 1, the biology of status. 2 would be empathy versus compassion. Those might sound like very similar things, but some thinkers are starting to recognize that there are important differences between those two. And I think that would make for a really interesting topic to discuss. And finally, I'm going to suggest that we perhaps try discussing the science of science denial. What does science tell us about why people deny science? What are the neurological and psychological underpinnings of science denial, and what can we do about it? Okay, so those are my three topics. I'm happy to add a fourth topic if somebody has one that they think would make for an interesting discussion. Daniela, do you have a suggestion? Okay. Patricia and Francesco, your hands are up. Is that because you have a topic to suggest, or just because you're ready to vote for one or the other? All right, I'm not hearing any. I'm about to call for votes. Okay, if you'd like to discuss the biology of status next month, please raise your hand now. Okay, you got the total, Sage? Okay, very good. Please put your hand back down. If you're interested in discussing empathy versus compassion. Okay, thank you everyone. Hands back down. And finally, the science of science denial. Wow, I think we have a clear winner. The third looks like a winner. So let's hope you'll all join us again next month at approximately this time of day. If you still have a thing or two you'd like to say on today's topic, dehumanization, I believe Sage and I could keep the Zoom meeting going, but my pledge in the past has been to wrap up within an hour, keep these short and sweet. Stick around for a few minutes if you like, but if not, thank you for joining us. Please do consider supporting this view of life, and support us with your presence and your insights, even if financial support isn't within your means just now.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
David, I'm seeing a hand up. Is that a vestige of our vote, or is that because you have something you'd like to? Okay. Anybody want to leave us with a parting word? Is that Patricia, please?
I think we still need to define humanness. So, because when you read, about, say, theory of mind or things that are definitions of humanness, as we study the other species more and more, we find that they actually have some of these characteristics that we have defined as humanness. So that's sort of what has been going through my mind throughout this whole discussion, is we haven't really come up with a good way to define humanness, and maybe we need to, broaden the word to, not debasing any life form. So
I think that's a really fine point. One of the best philosophical ways I know to accomplish what is it Patricia is talking about was bypass the question of humanness entirely and ask yourself, what is it that makes somebody worthy of moral or what is it that makes something or someone or a being capable, worthy of moral consideration? And Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, of course, famously answered, sentience. If you can feel pain, if you can suffer, you deserve moral consideration, whether you're human or not. In some ways, that's the more important question, right? If the key thing that rides on our determination of humanness is whether or not they deserve to be treated well, we can just cut out the humanness and just say, well, what is it that makes something worthy of humane treatment?
Then I think of individuals who have severe intellectual disability, and determining sentience and cognition, cognitive capacity in those individuals is very difficult. So, you know, there's always, I guess, what gives us the right to debase someone or something else is another way to look at it.
In some ways, that kind of flips it upside down by saying, I don't need to prove that I am worthy of your moral consideration. You need to prove that I'm somehow worth less than full moral consideration. Put the burden of proof on the other side. Nice. Steve?
I was just going to recommend a book that I'm about 2/3 of the way done with. It's somewhat related to this, and it's Ezra Klein's book, Why We're Polarized. And Ezra Klein is a journalist. He's the co-founder of Vox, if you know that website. And it's a really, I mean, it's more of a political science book and political psychology book, but and to the degree that Democrats and Republicans tend to dehumanize each other, it's relevant to today's topic. It's really a fascinating book in which his central thesis is that the political structure is structured in a way to create the polarization that we have. Everyone is behaving rationally according to the incentives that the political system has. And so well, I won't say more, but it's if you're interested in particularly, well, I guess it's not just America, there's increased political polarization in lots of Western democracies, not just America, but it's one of the better books I've read, and I would encourage you to take a look at it.
Steve, do you have any idea how I might contact Ezra Klein? I've been meaning to correspond with him about this very topic.
Well, typically the way to reach an author would be to go through the publisher. And so I don't, you'd have to look on Amazon. I forget who the publisher is, but if you go through the publisher, that they'll put you in touch typically with an author, I think.
Thank you. I've been meaning to read his book.
Yeah. I think he does have a Facebook page too, but I don't know if he'd probably respond more through the professional route of his publisher.
So I'll take that comment as an excuse to mention my own book about why we're polarized. The title is quite different, but I hope you all keep your eyes open for my book titled Mental Immunity. It's about how the mind has an immune system that can break down under certain forms of partisan or ideological pressure, and how we can build up mental immune systems and become far more capable critical thinkers. That book is still a few months away from hitting the shelves, but hope you'll keep your eye open for it. Guys, thank you very much. I'm going to suggest we sign off now, and I look forward to seeing you all again. It's really wonderful to hear so many interesting perspectives and so much insight. It's a real privilege being able to do this with you all.
Bye.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.